September 1st, 1939, and the Polish town of Wieluń awakened to a sound that would echo through the nightmares of an entire generation. At 4:40 in the morning, before Germany had formally declared war, the air itself seemed to tear apart with a horrifying mechanical wail, a sound deliberately engineered to paralyze the human soul. The Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, soon to be known worldwide as Stukas, descended from the pre-dawn darkness like metallic birds of prey, their distinctive gull wings silhouetted against the lightning flashes of their own bombardment. The town hospital took the first strike. 75% of Wieluń would be destroyed in those opening minutes of World War II, and approximately 1,200 civilians would perish before most of Europe even knew the conflict had begun. This was not collateral damage. This was the Stuka's intended purpose: to break the will of nations through technological terror. Hans Ulrich Rudel, who would become the most decorated German serviceman of the war, stood among the Stuka pilots preparing for the Polish campaign. He remembered the briefings where Luftwaffe officers explained the psychological weapon mounted to each aircraft's landing gear, the Jericho trumpet, named for the biblical walls that fell to trumpet blasts. These sirens served no tactical purpose beyond fear. They made the Stuka slower, more vulnerable, easier to shoot down. But when that banshee scream preceded the vertical dive, when soldiers and civilians alike heard death approaching at 300 miles per hour, rational thought evaporated. According to military historian James Holland's research published in The War in the West, references from extensive Luftwaffe archives, the Stuka's design philosophy represented a radical departure from conventional bombing doctrine. While other nations developed high-altitude horizontal bombers, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's engineers created something entirely different: a flying artillery piece that could place a 1,000-pound bomb within 30 feet of a target from a near-vertical dive of 85 degrees. The aircraft itself was grotesque in its efficiency. The Ju-87's inverted gull wings gave pilots exceptional visibility downward, crucial when diving nearly straight at the earth. Fixed landing gear created drag that helped control dive speed, though it made the plane appear perpetually awkward, like a predatory bird that never quite retracted its talons. The spatted wheel covers became as recognizable as the siren, a visual signature that sent soldiers diving for cover even before the scream began. Pilot Werner Baumbach described his first combat dive over Poland in terms that mixed exhilaration with something approaching religious experience. Rolling inverted at 15,000 feet, pulling back into the dive, watching the altimeter unwind as the target grew from a map reference to a visible structure to something filling the entire windscreen. The siren would automatically activate as airspeed increased, building from a moan to a shriek. At 3,000 feet, muscle memory and training overcame the human body's screaming instinct to pull up. Not yet. Not yet. Waiting for the bombing site's indicator to align. Release. Then the brutal pullout, gravity crushing the pilot into his seat with forces that could black out the unprepared. The Stuka's automatic dive brakes preventing the aircraft from simply disintegrating under stress. Those first days in Poland proved the concept devastatingly effective. Polish cavalry units, already obsolete against tanks, broke entirely under Stuka attack. Supply columns scattered. Communications centers vanished in precision strikes. The psychological impact spread faster than the actual bombs, rumors of the unstoppable scream machines racing ahead of the German advance. The Junkers Ju-87's origins reached back to 1933, when the Nazi Party's rearmament program accelerated despite Versailles Treaty restrictions. Ernst Udet, a World War I fighter ace and the Reich's Director General of Equipment, had witnessed American dive bombing demonstrations and became obsessed with the tactics' precision. He convinced Reichsmarshal Göring that dive bombers could replace costly artillery, providing close air support that moved at the speed of modern warfare rather than the plodding pace of horse-drawn guns. Hermann Pohlmann, Junkers' chief designer, received specifications that seemed contradictory. Create an aircraft stable enough for novice pilots, yet capable of near-vertical dives that would destroy most airframes. The solution emerged through unconventional engineering. The inverted gull wings weren't merely aesthetic. They shortened the landing gear length needed for ground clearance, reducing weight and drag. The dive brakes, perforated metal plates that swung out beneath the wings, gave pilots confidence to push dives to extreme angles without exceeding structural limits. But Pullman's most controversial innovation came from Udet himself, the Jericho sirens. Small propeller-driven devices attached to the landing gear fairings, they served no military function beyond psychological warfare. Wind-driven by the dive's airspeed, they produced a frequency calculated to trigger primal human fear responses. Later variants would include siren-equipped bombs themselves, ensuring the scream continued even after the aircraft pulled away. Testing began in 1935 at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret evaluation center. Prototype crashes killed several test pilots before engineers resolved the extreme stresses of high-speed pullouts. The solution involved an automated system. Pilots pushed a button at dive initiation, and the aircraft itself controlled the recovery, triggering dive brakes, releasing bombs at the correct altitude, and pulling up at 6 Gs of force, enough to gray out most pilots' vision but below the structural failure threshold. Captain Ernst Kupfer, among the first operational Stuka pilots, described the sensation in his memoir, Dive into Darkness. The aircraft, he wrote, became an extension of the pilot's violent intent. Unlike level bombing, where crews never saw individual victims, Stuka pilots watched their targets in horrifying detail. A bridge, a truck convoy, a bunker. Then faces, sometimes, soldiers looking up at the last moment, civilians running. The bomb's release brought momentary weightlessness before the crushing pullout, and pilots would struggle to consciousness as their Stukas clawed back toward the sky, leaving devastation in their wake. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 provided the first combat testing. The Condor Legion, Germany's volunteer force supporting Franco's nationalists, deployed Stukas against Republican positions. At Guernica on April 26, 1937, Stukas participated in the destruction that would inspire Picasso's famous painting, though Heinkel 111s dropped most of the tonnage. The lesson learned wasn't about civilian casualties. Nazi doctrine considered terror bombing legitimate, but about tactical efficiency. Stukas could eliminate specific targets, bridges, command posts, artillery positions. By September 1939, the Luftwaffe possessed 336 operational Stukas, organized into specialized dive bomber wings called Sturzkampfgeschwader. Pilots trained obsessively, practicing dives until the sequence became instinctive. Roll inverted, pull through to vertical, acquire target, ride the scream down, release, pull out, survive. Survival proved the critical variable. In Poland's opening weeks, Stukas dominated skies largely cleared by Messerschmitt 109 fighters. The question remaining, one that would be answered in blood over France, Britain, and Russia, was how these slow, specialized aircraft would perform against modern air defenses and determined fighter opposition. The German military newspaper Die Wehrmacht published glowing accounts of Stuka victories, calling the aircraft the most feared weapon in the sky. This assessment would prove tragically premature. The Stuka's invincibility rested on air superiority, and air superiority was never guaranteed. May 10, 1940, and the Stuka wings assembled along Germany's western border represented the largest concentration of dive bombers ever deployed. 475 aircraft prepared to strike simultaneously into Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. The Fall Gelb operation, Case Yellow, would test whether the Polish success could be replicated against modern, prepared enemies. At dawn, Belgian fortress Ebenemehl stood as Europe's most advanced fortification, its artillery dominating crossings of the Albert Canal. Built into a hillside with reinforced concrete walls and underground barracks, it was considered impregnable. The Belgian garrison of 1,200 men had trained for years defending this position. They had 90 minutes of peace remaining, Stukas from Sturzkampfgeschwader. 77 climbed to altitude while German glider troops landed directly on the fortress roof. The Stuka's role was specific: crater the surface installations and keep defenders underground while the elite paratroopers destroyed gun emplacements with shaped charges. The attack achieved complete surprise. As referenced in historian Antony Beevor's The Second World War, which draws from Wehrmacht operational records, The fortress surrendered within 30 hours, opening Belgium to German armor. Pilot Paul Werner Hausel led a Stuka Staffel squadron into France days later, targeting the Meuse River crossings near Sedan. Here, the German plan required speed above all else. Panzer divisions needed bridges across the Meuse to exploit their breakthrough, but French artillery dominated the opposite bank. Conventional bombing couldn't guarantee the precision needed to eliminate specific gun positions without destroying the bridges themselves. The Luftwaffe's solution was overwhelming. Wave after wave of Stukas, each attacking at 10-minute intervals from dawn until dusk on May 13th. Hausel remembered the scene as apocalyptic. Dozens of aircraft stacked at different altitudes, diving in rotation, their sirens creating overlapping waves of sound that merged into continuous mechanical thunder. French defenders, many of them colonial troops from North Africa, experiencing their first combat, endured hours of near-vertical assault without respite. The psychological effect exceeded German expectations. French artillery crews abandoned functioning guns not because of physical destruction, but because human minds couldn't maintain coherence under sustained Stuka attack. Officers reported men weeping, catatonic, or simply fleeing rearward despite having ammunition and operational weapons. The guns fell silent, not through elimination but through psychological annihilation. German engineers threw bridges across the Meuse by nightfall. Panzer divisions poured through, beginning the drive that would reach the English Channel in 10 days and force France's surrender within 6 weeks. The Stuka's role in this victory seemed decisive, validating Udet's vision of dive bombers as the decisive weapon of modern war. But cracks appeared even in victory. French fighter pilot Pierre Le Glouan of Groupe de Chasse 3/6 discovered the Stuka's vulnerability through simple observation. The aircraft were helpless during pullout. Diving at maximum speed, the Stuka pilot fought consciousness while the automatic systems recovered the aircraft. For 3 to 5 seconds, the plane flew straight and level, climbing slowly, unable to maneuver. A fighter arriving during this window faced a nearly stationary target. Le Glouan shot down 4 Stukas in a single engagement over the Meuse on May 19th, attacking each as it completed its dive. His kill claims were verified through German records after the war. He reported that Stuka rear gunners, each aircraft carried a single machine gunner facing backward, proved largely ineffective against a fighter attacking from below during the climb-out. The single 7.92mm machine gun couldn't generate enough fire to deter a determined attack. The Luftwaffe lost 39 Stukas to all causes during the French campaign, manageable losses given the aircraft's decisive impact. But these losses occurred while German fighters maintained air superiority. In confined engagements where French fighters broke through, Stuka losses spiked dramatically. The pattern suggested troubling implications that German, August 13, 1940 marked Adler Tag, Eagle Day, the intended start of Britain's aerial annihilation. Reichsmarschall Göring promised to destroy the Royal Air Force within 4 days, clearing the way for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Among his most potent weapons were the battle-hardened Stuka wings that had terrorized Poland and France. 280 Stukas deployed to forward bases along the French coast, prepared to strike British airfields, radar stations, and ports with the precision that had shattered continental resistance. The first major engagement came on August 8th, when Stuka Geschwader 77 attacked a British convoy in the English Channel. 30 Stukas with Messerschmitt 109 escort engaged what appeared to be a manageable target, merchant ships with minimal air cover. Then Spitfires from Royal Air Force 609 Squadron arrived, and the engagement transformed into carnage. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas described the scene in his combat report, later archived at the Imperial War Museum. The Stukas, committed to their dives, couldn't break off when fighters appeared. British pilots simply waited for each dive bomber to pull out, then attacked during those helpless seconds of recovery. The Spitfire's 8 machine guns, fired in concentrated bursts at close range, shredded the Stuka's relatively light construction. Dundas himself claimed 3 confirmed kills in under 5 minutes. 15 Stukas fell that day. The ratio was unsustainable, but Göring dismissed warnings. The dive bomber's terror reputation, he insisted, justified the losses. Stukas would break British morale as they had broken French and Polish morale. The attacks continued. Captain Helmut Malke of Sturzkampfgeschwader 1 flew missions throughout August, and his perspective shifted from confidence to growing dread. Unlike in Poland and France, British fighters appeared consistently. The Spitfires and Hurricanes possessed speed advantages that made them impossible to evade. German Messerschmitt escorts fought their own desperate battles at altitude and couldn't maintain constant Stuka protection. Each mission became a calculated risk. Would British fighters be waiting? The answer increasingly was yes. RAF Fighter Command, directed by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's integrated radar and observer system, allocated resources specifically to intercept Stuka formations. British pilots learned to ignore the escorts if possible, diving past Messerschmitts to reach the vulnerable dive bombers. The psychological effect reversed. German Stuka crews now experienced the terror they'd inflicted on others, knowing that any mission might encounter fighters they couldn't outrun or outmaneuver. August 18th brought the crisis. Stuka formations attacked airfields at Gosport Ford and Thorney Island. British fighters intercepted in force. 16 Stukas were destroyed, several more crashed attempting emergency landings with battle damage, and dozens of crew members died or were captured. The Luftwaffe had inflicted damage on British infrastructure, but the exchange rate was catastrophic. 3 days later, Goering withdrew the Stukas from the Battle of Britain. Officially, the aircraft were redeployed for other operations. In practice, the Ju-87 had been defeated, its vulnerability to modern fighters decisively exposed. The terror weapon that dominated continental warfare proved nearly suicidal against an opponent with effective fighter defenses and early warning systems. Werner Baumbach, now a major, compiled casualty reports with growing horror. Some Stuka groups had lost over 40% of their experienced crews in 2 weeks. Pilots who'd survived Poland and France died over southern England, their aircraft transformed from predator to prey. The psychological impact on surviving crews was profound. The men who'd once been instruments of terror now flinched at engine sounds, knowing that British Merlins had a distinctive note that meant death was approaching at 300 miles per hour. The Battle of Britain transformed Stuka doctrine. Never again would the aircraft operate without overwhelming air superiority. Never again would the dive bombers be committed against modern air defenses without absolute certainty that enemy fighters had been suppressed. These lessons would shape Mediterranean and Eastern Front operations, but they came at a terrible price. The Stuka's invincibility myth, so carefully cultivated through newsreels and propaganda, lay shattered in the wreckage scattered across Kent and Sussex. October 28, 1940, and Benito Mussolini's disastrous invasion of Greece from Albania created opportunities for German intervention. By April 1941, when Wehrmacht forces swept south through Yugoslavia and Greece to rescue Italy's defeated armies, Stukas returned to the role they performed best, supporting ground forces against opponents without effective air defenses. The Greek campaign demonstrated the aircraft's continued effectiveness under proper conditions. Stuka wings demolished Greek fortifications, shattered supply lines, and provided close support that allowed German mountain troops to overcome defensive positions that might otherwise have delayed the advance for weeks. British Commonwealth forces evacuating from Greece experienced the Stuka terror that Polish and French troops had endured. The screaming dive, the precision bombing, the psychological weight of an enemy that struck from above with apparent impunity. But the Mediterranean's most dramatic Stuka operations occurred on the island of Malta. This British fortress, positioned between Sicily and North Africa, threatened every Axis supply convoy attempting to reach Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. The island's neutralization became essential for Axis Mediterranean strategy. Hauptmann Werner Hischold commanded 2nd Gruppe of Sturzkampfgeschwader 3, deployed to Sicily specifically to attack Malta. The campaign began in January 1942 and continued with varying intensity through the year. According to research published in Malta the Hurricane Years by Christopher Shores and Brian Cull, which extensively documents combat records from both sides, Stuka attacks focused on the island's 3 airfields, its submarine base, and the dockyard facilities that serviced British warships and submarines. The attacks achieved devastating effect. By spring 1942, Malta teetered on the edge of starvation and surrender. Airfields were so heavily cratered that fighter operations became nearly impossible. Supply convoys attempting to reach the island faced aerial attacks throughout their journey, and even those that arrived found ports so damaged that unloading became a deadly, prolonged process under continued bombardment. British fighter pilot Norman McQueen, flying Spitfires from Malta's Takali airfield, described missions against Stuka formations escorted by Messerschmitt 109s and Italian Machi fighters. The mathematics remained brutal. Spitfires that broke through the escort screen could massacre Stukas, but breaking through required superior numbers or exceptional luck. German escorts had learned from the Battle of Britain, maintaining closer formation discipline and immediately engaging any British fighters before they could reach the dive bombers. One engagement on March 27 demonstrated both the Stuka's continued lethality and its vulnerability. 12 Stukas from Hischolds Gruppe attacked Takali with strong escort, cratering runways and destroying 3 parked Hurricanes. But 4 Spitfires managed to engage during the attack's conclusion, shooting down 3 Stukas in quick succession. The exchange, 3 grounded Hurricanes, and significant runway damage versus 3 Stukas and their crews, favored the defenders only because Malta's aircraft shortage had reached crisis levels. Germany could replace the Stukas. Malta's fighter strength was nearly exhausted. The siege's intensity decreased after May 1942, when Hitler denied authorization for Operation Hercules, the proposed airborne invasion of Malta. Instead, resources shifted to the Soviet Union, and Malta gradually recovered as supply convoys fought through with desperately needed provisions and replacement aircraft. The island survived, but the Stuka campaign had demonstrated that even well-defended targets could be neutralized through sustained precision bombing, provided the attackers accepted continuing losses and maintained fighter superiority. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Stukas provided crucial support for Rommel's campaigns. The Desert War's fluid nature, with mobile formations ranging across vast distances, suited the Stuka's capabilities. Dive bombers struck British supply dumps, destroyed tanks during crucial battles like Gazala, and suppressed artillery positions that threatened German advances. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, transferred to North Africa in early 1942, found the desert environment paradoxically liberating. Targets stood out clearly against the sand, no foliage or urban clutter to obscure bombing runs. British mobile columns created distinctive dust plumes visible for miles. Yet the environment imposed costs. Sand infiltrated everything, engines required constant maintenance, and the heat produced thermals that made low-level flying treacherous. The Mediterranean campaigns preserved the Stuka's reputation while obscuring the fundamental lesson of Britain. Against determined, well-equipped opposition with fighter cover, the Ju-87 suffered catastrophic losses. Success in Greece, Malta, and North Africa occurred because the Luftwaffe maintained local air superiority, and British forces faced overwhelming numbers with limited resources. June 22, 1941, 3:30 in the morning, and the largest military operation in human history commenced along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa unleashed 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and overwhelming air support against the Soviet Union. Among the first aircraft over Soviet territory were approximately 300 Stukas, assigned to obliterate Red Air Force installations before Soviet pilots could respond. The opening strikes achieved success beyond German expectations. Stuka formations attacked airfields across Western Soviet territory, finding hundreds of aircraft parked in neat rows, perfect targets. Soviet fighters and bombers, many obsolete by current standards, exploded or burned before their crews could reach them. By the campaign's first day's end, the Red Air Force had lost approximately 1,200 aircraft, many destroyed on the ground by precision Stuka attacks. Oberleutnant Walter Ziegel, piloting a Stuka from Sturzkampfgeschwader 2, described the early weeks as the closest warfare came to sport. Soviet air defenses proved nearly non-existent. Anti-aircraft fire was inaccurate and sparse. Soviet fighters, when they appeared, were mostly obsolete Polikarpov biplanes that couldn't catch the Stukas even during vulnerable pullouts. German dive bombers ranged freely, demolishing bridges, supply depots, tank formations, and troop concentrations with impunity. But the Eastern Front's vast scale and brutal nature would transform the Stuka experience entirely. Unlike Western European campaigns, operations in the Soviet Union involved incomprehensible distances, extreme weather, and an enemy that absorbed losses that would have shattered any Western army. The Stukas that seemed so decisive in France found themselves as merely one element in grinding attritional warfare, where the front lines barely moved despite massive expenditure of ordnance and lives. Winter 1941 brought crisis. Temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees, freezing oil, cracking engine blocks, and making simple maintenance nearly impossible. Hans Ulrich Rudel, now serving on the Eastern Front, described ground crews working with torches to thaw engines before dawn missions. Frostbite injuries among ground crew exceeded combat casualties. Stukas that managed to take off faced icing conditions that rendered instruments unreliable and made landing on snow-covered fields perilous. Soviet resistance stiffened dramatically. New fighters, Yak-1s, Lay GG-3s, and later the formidable Yak-9s, possessed performance comparable to German types. Soviet pilots, initially outmatched by German training and experience, learned rapidly from surviving encounters. By 1942, Stukas operating without heavy escort faced losses reminiscent of the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943 demonstrated both the Stuka's continued tactical value and its limitations in modern warfare. Dive bombers supported German forces fighting for every building in the ruined city, delivering precision strikes on Soviet strongpoints that conventional artillery couldn't eliminate. Yet the strategic situation, an entire army trapped in an urban battlefield and eventually encircled, rendered such tactical successes meaningless. According to Soviet military historian David Glantz's research in When Titans Clashed, which draws from extensive Red Army archives, Soviet defenders in Stalingrad learned to endure Stuka attacks through dispersion and rapid movement. The psychological terror effect diminished as soldiers became accustomed to the sirens, understanding that the bombs fell on specific targets, while most defenders remained untouched. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries, positioned in depth around the city, imposed increasing costs on German dive bomber operations. Rudel himself became the war's most successful Stuka pilot during Eastern Front operations, eventually credited with destroying over 500 tanks, a number that remains controversial and likely inflated by the fog of war and propaganda requirements. His technique involved attacking Soviet armor with 37mm cannon-equipped Stukas, diving to extremely low altitude and firing armor-piercing rounds at tank engine compartments and turret rings. This required exceptional skill and suicidal courage, exposing the aircraft to intense ground fire from every angle. The Eastern Front consumed Stukas and their crews with mechanical efficiency. By 1943, veteran pilots from the war's opening had mostly died, been wounded beyond return to duty, or succumbed to psychological breakdown. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training, learning their craft in combat where mistakes proved instantly fatal. The Stuka wings maintained operational strength through constant personnel influx, but the experienced corps that had terrorized Poland and France was gone, scattered in anonymous graves from Stalingrad to Kursk. July 5, 1943, and the largest tank battle in history erupted near the Soviet city of Kursk. Operation Citadel represented Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front, an attempt to destroy Soviet forces in a massive pincer movement. Both sides committed their strategic reserves. The Luftwaffe deployed every available aircraft, including hundreds of Stukas, tasked with breaking Soviet tank formations. The battle's opening demonstrated how completely warfare had evolved beyond the Stuka's glory days. Soviet defenses incorporated multiple fortified lines, extensive minefields, and anti-aircraft guns positioned in unprecedented density. Stuka formations attacking Soviet armor at Kursk faced walls of flak that turned the sky into shrapnel-filled chaos. Aircraft that survived anti-aircraft fire often discovered that Soviet tanks had learned to disperse, moving constantly, making the precision bombing that was the Stuka's advantage far less effective against mobile targets. Soviet fighters appeared in overwhelming numbers. The Yakovlev Design Bureau's latest fighters matched German performance, and Soviet pilots had accumulated 4 years of combat experience. Stuka formations required massive escorts, and even then suffered steady attrition. The kill ratio that had favored Germany so dramatically in 1941 had reversed. Soviet fighters destroyed German aircraft at rates that made each mission a calculated sacrifice. Hans Ulrich Rudel continued flying throughout Kursk, accumulating tank kills and decorations while the broader offensive collapsed. The pattern of his success revealed the Stuka's reduced role. Individual skilled pilots using specialized tactics could achieve results, but the aircraft no longer served as a war-winning weapon. It had become a niche tool, effective in specific circumstances, but unable to influence strategic outcomes. By late 1943, Stuka production decreased dramatically. The Reich Ministry of Armaments, under Albert Speer's direction, redirected resources toward fighters desperately needed to counter Allied strategic bombing and ground attack aircraft, better suited to modern warfare's demands. The Focke-Wulf 190, capable of both fighter and ground attack roles, gradually replaced specialized dive bombers in frontline service. The remaining Stukas found their final purpose providing night harassment raids against Soviet positions. Operating under darkness, flying low to avoid radar detection, Stukas dropped small bombs on Soviet rear areas, attacked supply convoys, and generally attempted to deny Soviet forces rest. These operations bore little resemblance to the terror attacks that opened the war. They were mosquito bites against a bear, painful, annoying, but utterly unable to affect the bear's advance westward. Rudel himself symbolized the Stuka's declining relevance. By 1944, he had flown over 2,000 combat missions, an almost incomprehensible number representing years of daily near-death experiences. He had been shot down 30 times, wounded 5 times, and witnessed countless comrades die. His decorations included the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, a unique award created specifically for him by Hitler, who used Rudel's continued survival as propaganda evidence that German will could overcome material disadvantage. Yet Rudel's individual achievements couldn't mask the reality. Germany was losing. Soviet armies advanced relentlessly westward. Allied forces had invaded Italy and would soon land in France. The Luftwaffe's fighter strength dwindled under constant attrition. Stukas soldiered on in diminishing numbers, their crews aware they were flying obsolete aircraft in a war already lost. The final major Stuka operations occurred during the desperate defensive battles of 1944. As Soviet forces pushed into Poland, East Prussia, and the Balkans, Stukas attempted to slow the advance through close support of retreating German units. The sirens still wailed, bombs still fell precisely, but the effect had become negligible. Soviet armies possessed such overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, and aircraft that individual tactical successes meant nothing. By war's end, fewer than 100 operational Stukas remained. Most had been destroyed in combat, abandoned during retreats, or scrapped for parts to keep fighters operational. The aircraft that had symbolized German aerial supremacy and psychological warfare became a historical curiosity, its terror reputation outlasting its actual battlefield relevance by years. The siren that had frozen Polish cavalry, French colonial troops, and early Soviet defenders in paralyzed fear had become merely another sound in the mechanical cacophony of total war. Recognizable but no longer capable of inspiring the existential dread that was its primary weapon. The Stuka's true innovation was never purely technological. Other nations developed dive bombers, the American Douglas Dauntless, the Soviet Petlyakov P-2, the Japanese Aichi D-3A Val, some with superior performance characteristics. What distinguished the Ju-87 was its deliberate engineering of terror, the conscious decision to make the aircraft not just deadly, but psychologically devastating. Dr. Fritz Trelich, a Luftwaffe psychological warfare specialist, documented the siren's effect in reports now archived at the Bundesarchiv Military Archive in Freiburg. His research, conducted through interviews with captured enemy soldiers and civilians, revealed consistent patterns. The Stuka's scream triggered panic responses that bypassed rational thought. Soldiers who'd maintained discipline under conventional bombing broke under Stuka attack. The sound's frequency, combined with its crescendo as the aircraft accelerated in its dive, activated primal fear mechanisms that human evolution had developed to respond to predatory threats. This weaponized psychology proved remarkably effective against unprepared opponents. Polish cavalry units, still recovering from the shock of mechanized warfare, essentially dissolved when Stukas attacked. French colonial troops from North Africa, many of whom had never experienced aerial bombardment, sometimes fled miles rearward after a single Stuka strike, despite minimal casualties. The terror spread faster than the actual bombs, rumors and fear proving more destructive than high explosives. But psychological warfare possessed limitations that German planners underestimated. Human beings adapt. Soldiers who survived repeated Stuka attacks gradually developed coping mechanisms. Soviet troops at Stalingrad learned that the scream's intensity didn't correlate with danger. A Stuka diving on a target 500 yards away produced the same terrifying sound as one directly overhead. British troops in North Africa discovered that well-constructed slit trenches provided protection even from near miss, and that the Stuka's precision diminished significantly when pilots faced ground fire that forced them to release earlier and pull out faster. The adaptation process appeared clearly in combat effectiveness reports. In Poland, a single Stuka staffel could cause battalion-sized units to abandon positions. By 1943 on the Eastern Front, the same staffel might temporarily suppress a strong point, but couldn't force retreat without sustained attack. The weapon's psychological edge dulled with repeated exposure, and once soldiers understood they could survive Stuka strikes through proper precautions, the terror dissipated into merely fear, a manageable emotion rather than a mind-breaking force. Moreover, the Stuka's psychological reputation became a liability. Allied propaganda, particularly British, transformed the aircraft from unstoppable terror weapon into vulnerable target. Royal Air Force combat footage showing Spitfires destroying Stukas, widely distributed through newsreels and publications, reversed the psychological warfare. British civilians watched German aircraft falling in flames, and British soldiers learned that the scream machines could be killed. The myth of invincibility once shattered couldn't be rebuilt. The crew experience itself revealed psychological costs Germany hadn't anticipated. Stuka pilots suffered extreme psychological stress, higher than bomber pilots who attacked from altitude and never saw individual targets, higher even than fighter pilots who engaged in abstract aerial combat. Diving nearly vertically at the ground violated every human instinct. The automated pull-out system meant pilots experienced those crucial seconds in semi-conscious state, their vision graying or blacking completely, their bodies crushed by G-forces, uncertain whether they'd recover or simply impact. Psychiatrist Hauptmann Heinrich Bergengruen, assigned to Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 in 1942, documented psychological breakdown patterns among Stuka crews. Combat exhaustion appeared after fewer missions than in other aircraft types. Pilots developed chronic nightmares, often involving dreams where the automatic pull-out failed and they watched the ground rushing up. Rear gunners, who rode through dives facing backward and essentially helpless, experienced even higher psychological casualty rates. The Stuka's rear gunner position represented perhaps the war's most psychologically demanding aerial role. The gunner sat facing rearward as the pilot rolled inverted and dove, experiencing all the G-forces and danger with none of the control. Their single machine gun provided minimal protection against attacking fighters. They watched comrades' aircraft explode, disintegrate, or spin out of control, knowing they'd face identical fate if their pilot made any error or if enemy fighters broke through. The crew survival rate told the story. By 1943, a Stuka crew's statistical life expectancy on the Eastern Front measured in weeks, not months. As the war progressed and the Stuka's vulnerability became undeniable, Junkers and Luftwaffe engineers attempted modifications to extend the aircraft's battlefield viability. The Ju-87D variant, introduced in 1941, featured improved engines, enhanced armor protection, and upgraded defensive armament. The single rear-facing machine gun increased to 2, providing slightly better defensive coverage, but fundamental design limitations couldn't be overcome through incremental improvements. The Stuka's fixed landing gear, essential for dive control, created drag that limited maximum speed to approximately 250 miles per hour, far slower than contemporary fighters. The gull-wing configuration, which provided excellent visibility for dive bombing, made the aircraft large and distinctive, easy to spot and track. Every attempt to increase speed or maneuverability degraded the precision dive bombing capability that justified the Stuka's existence. The most significant evolution came with anti-tank variants. Recognizing that precision bombing of armored vehicles required different approaches than conventional target attacks, engineers developed the Ju-87G, equipped with two 37mm cannon mounted in underwing pods. This configuration, flown primarily by highly skilled pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rudel, transformed the Stuka from dive bomber into tank destroyer. The anti-tank Stuka's tactics differed dramatically from traditional dive bombing. Instead of near vertical dives from altitude, cannon-armed Stukas attacked at low level, approaching tanks from behind or the sides where armor was thinnest. Pilots fired short bursts at ranges under 500 yards, aiming for engine compartments, ammunition storage, or the vulnerable junction between turret and hull. The technique required pilots to fly directly into concentrated defensive fire, tank machine guns, infantry small arms, and proximity anti-aircraft batteries all engaged simultaneously. Rudel's claimed tank kills, while likely exaggerated, demonstrated the tactic's theoretical effectiveness. Combat camera footage verified that skilled pilots could disable or destroy tanks with cannon fire, but the cost was prohibitive. Most pilots lacked Rudel's exceptional ability. The majority of anti-tank Stuka missions resulted in damaged aircraft, wounded crews, or complete losses. For every tank destroyed, the Luftwaffe sacrificed resources, trained pilots, irreplaceable aircraft, maintenance hours that Germany could no longer afford. By 1944, the Stuka program had become essentially a prestige project maintained through bureaucratic inertia and Hitler's personal attachment to the aircraft that symbolized early war victories. Rational resource allocation would have terminated production entirely, redirecting factory capacity toward fighters that might contest Allied air superiority. Instead, modified Stukas continued rolling from assembly lines in diminishing numbers, consumed immediately by the Eastern Front's insatiable appetite for aircraft. The final Stuka variant, the Ju-87H, appeared in limited numbers during 1944. This version incorporated lessons from years of bitter combat: additional armor plate protecting the pilot and rear gunner, improved engines salvaged from other programs, and enhanced defensive armament. Yet these modifications couldn't overcome the fundamental obsolescence. The H-variant Stuka remained slower than any contemporary fighter, vulnerable during pullouts, and dependent on air superiority that Germany no longer possessed anywhere. Technical desperation manifested in experimental variants that never reached production. Proposals included night fighter Stukas with radar, torpedo bomber Stukas for anti-shipping operations, and even jet-assisted takeoff systems to improve performance from damaged airfields. None addressed the core problem. The dive bomber concept itself had been superseded by fighter bombers that combined acceptable ground attack capability with self-defense ability. The Focke-Wulf 190, entering service from 1941 onward, demonstrated the future of ground attack aviation. This aircraft could fight enemy fighters when necessary, deliver bombs and rockets against ground targets with reasonable accuracy, and survive in contested airspace where Stukas simply died. By 1944, rational German commanders requested 190s for ground attack missions. Only ideologically motivated officers or those without alternatives accepted Stuka allocations. Ground crews who'd maintained Stukas throughout the war developed bitter affection for the aircraft, mixed with recognition of its obsolescence. Feldwebel Otto Kittel, a veteran mechanic with Sturzkampfgeschwader 3, described the Ju-87 as honest. It performed exactly as designed, reliably without surprises. Unlike high-performance fighters that killed pilots through mechanical failures or handling quirks, the Stuka was forgiving, but forgiveness didn't equal survivability. Kittel watched crews depart on missions and calculated which wouldn't return based purely on operational circumstances. Insufficient escort, heavy enemy fighter presence, strong ground defenses. The calculations proved grimly accurate. The Eastern Front's final year saw Stukas reduced to essentially expendable assets. Missions were assigned, not because the aircraft could accomplish objectives, but because they were available, and some strike was better than none. Crews understood this calculus. They flew knowing their missions were desperate gestures, tactical pinpricks against Soviet offensives that advanced regardless. Some pilots developed fatalistic attitudes, continuing operations through sheer professionalism. Others suffered psychological breaks, unable to reconcile the futility of their efforts with the extreme danger each mission represented. The engineering evolution that should have saved the Stuka never materialized because saving it was impossible. The aircraft represented a doctrinal approach, precision dive bombing in uncontested airspace, that belonged to a war that no longer existed. By 1945, the few remaining operational Stukas flew night harassment missions or desperate ground attack sorties, supporting retreating German forces. The sirens still functioned, still wailed during dives, but nobody heard them with terror anymore. They were simply another sound in the apocalyptic symphony of the Third Reich's collapse. May 8, 1945, and the surrender of German forces ended the European War. Among the countless weapon systems that would be catalogued, analyzed, and judged by history, the Junkers Ju-87 occupied a peculiar position. It had been simultaneously highly effective and profoundly flawed, a terror weapon whose terror proved temporary, a precision instrument rendered obsolete by the total war it helped initiate. Allied intelligence teams examining captured Stukas approached the aircraft with curiosity mixed with confusion. American and British engineers understood the technical principles. Dive bombing wasn't mysterious. The structural engineering was conventional if robust. What puzzled them was the siren. Technical teams removed the Jericho trumpet devices, examined them, tested them. A purely psychological weapon, engineers concluded. It served no tactical function. It made the aircraft slower, more vulnerable. Yet German designers had deliberately engineered terror into their weapon system, treating fear as a measurable output equivalent to explosive tonnage. Post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe personnel revealed complex attitudes toward the Stuka and its legacy. Ernst Kupfer, the early Stuka pioneer who survived the war, expressed pride in the aircraft's technical achievements while acknowledging its role in aggressive warfare. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated Stuka pilot, never wavered in defending the aircraft and his service, though his unrepentant Nazi sympathies complicated historical assessment of his testimony. Werner Baumbach, who transitioned to Bomber Command, offered more critical perspective, noting that the Stuka's early successes had actually harmed German military development by validating dive bombing doctrine long after it should have been abandoned. The psychological warfare aspects generated particular scrutiny. Allied military psychologists studied the Stuka phenomenon as part of broader research into combat stress and fear responses. The Tavistock Institute in Britain and similar American organizations examined why the siren proved so effective initially, yet lost power through exposure. The research contributed to understanding of combat psychology, though the ethical implications, deliberately engineering terror into weapon systems, prompted uncomfortable questions that had no clear answers. All nations used fear as a weapon. The Stuka simply made the tactic explicit and mechanical. Soviet assessment of the Stuka came through bitter experience. Red Army analyses, declassified decades after the war, acknowledged the aircraft's devastating effectiveness in 1941, while noting the rapid Soviet adaptation. Soviet military doctrine evolved specifically to counter dive bomber attacks, dispersed formations, extensive anti-aircraft integration, fighter allocation prioritizing ground attack aircraft interception. The Stuka had forced Soviet tactical evolution, inadvertently strengthening Red Army capabilities. By teaching the Soviets to defend against precision air attack, the Luftwaffe had created an opponent increasingly resistant to German air power generally. Surviving Stukas faced varied fates. The Soviets captured dozens, evaluating some, scrapping most. A few flew in Soviet colors briefly, testing their characteristics against Soviet equipment. Britain and America shipped examples home for technical intelligence purposes, then relegated them to museums or scrapyards. By 1950, virtually no airworthy Stukas remained anywhere. The few preserved examples became museum pieces, static displays representing a vanished era. The aircraft's cultural legacy, however, persisted far beyond its service life. The Stuka's distinctive appearance, the gull wings, the fixed landing gear, became instantly recognizable shorthand for Nazi aggression. War films produced for decades featured Stuka footage or mock-ups. The scream sound effect accompanying virtually every cinematic depiction of Nazi aerial attack. This ubiquity in popular media ensured generations who'd never experienced World War II still recognized the Stuka's silhouette and associated sound. Historians grappling with the Stuka's place in military history reached no consensus. Some argued it represented brilliant innovation, the first weapon system designed holistically around psychological and tactical effects. Others contended it exemplified Nazi Germany's fundamental strategic confusion, prioritizing theatrical impact over sustainable military effectiveness. Both perspectives contained truth. The Stuka succeeded brilliantly in wars of rapid conquest against unprepared opponents, then failed catastrophically when warfare evolved beyond those parameters. The dive bomber concept itself didn't die with the Stuka. American Douglas Dauntless dive bombers proved decisive at Midway in June 1942, destroying 4 Japanese carriers and shifting the Pacific War's trajectory. Soviet Petlyakov P-2 dive bombers served effectively throughout the Eastern Front. The technique remained valid. The Stuka's specific implementation had been flawed. Modern military analysis, benefiting from decades of perspective and access to archives from all sides, views the Ju-87 as a case study in doctrine-technology mismatch. The aircraft performed exactly as designed, but the design reflected assumptions about warfare that were already outdated when the Stuka entered service. Pre-war theorists envisioned conflicts where air superiority was either assured or contested at levels permitting specialized aircraft operations. Reality delivered total war where air superiority was absolute or non-existent, with little middle ground. The Stuka needed that middle ground to survive. The human cost remains difficult to calculate precisely. Stuka attacks killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians across Europe and North Africa. The crews themselves suffered approximately 35 to 40% casualties over the war's course, killed, captured, or permanently disabled. Thousands of German pilots and gunners died flying an aircraft that High Command knew by 1943 at latest was obsolete and increasingly suicidal to operate. Yet the missions continued. Crews climbed into cockpits, sirens wailed over battlefields, because military bureaucracy and Hitler's personal attachment to early war symbols prevented rational reassessment. Perhaps the Stuka's most lasting legacy is cautionary. It demonstrated that technical sophistication and tactical effectiveness can mask strategic irrelevance. It proved that psychological weapons work until they don't, and adaptation neutralizes even the most terrifying innovations. It showed that early success can breed institutional rigidity, maintaining programs long after they've lost utility. And it revealed the human cost of weapons designed more for terror than for military necessity. Crews sacrificed not to achieve strategic objectives but to maintain the appearance of capability. Today, the few surviving Stukas rest in museums worldwide, their sirens silent, their bombs inert. Visitors photograph the gull wings and imagine the sound, that mechanical scream that once paralyzed armies. But the photographs are silent, and imagination cannot truly recreate the existential dread that the sirens of death once inspired. Perhaps that's appropriate. The terror was temporary, effective only until courage and adaptation overcame it. What remains is memory, warning, and the recognition that even the most fearsome weapons eventually fall silent, their scream fading into history's long, solemn quiet. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka began as innovation, peaked as terror, and ended as anachronism. A trajectory that perhaps inevitably awaits all weapons designed more to break the spirit than to win wars.